Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Thursday, February 13th, 2020. Your humble host is back from his winter break in Florida. I'll give you some details about our adventures with Pat and Mike. And at the end of the podcast, I will express my gratitude to the deputy sheriffs in Orlando who declined to arrest me after an altercation with a sleazy rent-a-car operation. But let's get to the news. And I have been away for a week. As I was packing to head to Florida, I watched the debacle of the Iowa caucus and its count. And now we are seeing all throughout the corporate media the meme, Bernie is so scary. It's coming from every angle. It's in every publication. It's on every TV show. Bernie Sanders, who has arguably a lead, but a narrow lead, coming out of the first two primary caucus adventures, is now seen as such a threat that Wall Street is attacking. Corporate media is expressing doubts, claiming that he's just too extreme. And the promotion of billionaire, authoritarian ex-mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg, continues apace. Now, let me start with the front page of my local blat. It is the Marin Independent Journal, and rarely do they put national news on the front page. It's all local stuff, usually. But here it is on the front page of today's paper. Democratic division could help Bloomberg. Moderates alarmed by Sanders might open door to ex-New York mayor. And in the second paragraph, within the Democratic establishment, the results have deepened a mood of anxiety and frustration. The collapse of Joe Biden's support in the first two states and the fragmentation of moderate voters have allowed Sanders, a Vermont progressive, to claim a thin victory in New Hampshire and an apparent split decision in Iowa with Pete Buttigieg. The story was picked up from the New York Times. It wasn't written by anybody at the local paper. Then the larger, regionally dominant San Francisco Chronicle picks up an Associated Press story. Headline, Sanders' narrow win ups pressure on moderates. Paragraph 3, but the Vermont senator is benefiting from a crowded and fractured primary field with several moderate candidates dividing up the rest of the vote. Taken together, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden drew support from more than 50% of New Hampshire voters, twice as much as Sanders. Now, for people who are unfamiliar with elections and how they work, this is total bullshit spin. There were 11 people on the ballot in New Hampshire. And for Sanders to finish first definitively in a crowded field like that is a victory. And adding up, different subtotals of the other candidates is meaningless. But for the low-information voter, it'll have the desired effect. Bernie, he's so scary. He's a socialist. He's a communist, Trump says. Now, before we get into some of the punditry about Sanders, let's look at how the New York Times spins up the data. They turn to their number cruncher, Nate Cohn, who's a decent number cruncher, and he makes the case that Sanders has a clear path to the nomination, and then goes through a bunch of buts and maybes and who knows what, and there's Bloomberg and blah, blah, blah. And fundamentally, the case that he makes is that the Democrats have a 15% rule. You saw it in Iowa. You're considered non-viable if you don't grab 15% of the caucus goers in a particular high school gymnasium. And it generally applies state by state in the primaries that the Democrats run. And so people like Buttigieg and Klobuchar, who had good nights, particularly in New Hampshire, they face an uncertain future because they're going to have to clear that 15% margin in states like Nevada, South Carolina, and the Super Tuesday states, including California. Based on the polling, the resources they have, the limited ground troops that they have in these critical states, it's going to be an uphill battle for them. And with Biden basically down and out, Warren stalled, and the entry of Mike Bloomberg, who is going to take voters away from Klobuchar and Buttigieg, the path for Sanders is to have a couple of stunning nights where he's the only one who clears the 15% margin. Now, I want to acknowledge that all of this is speculative. I cannot predict how this is going to play out, exactly how Bloomberg's entry, the money he's spending, will affect the Democratic primary voters. But the way they are spinning this and weaponizing Sanders' victory as a reason for people to be really, really afraid is pretty stunning. And all, guise of objectivity, of just reporting the facts, have been tossed out the window. And the way they've declared Buttigieg the winner in Iowa because he got one more delegate than Sanders, that is gamesmanship. But it is fair to say that Buttigieg has shown some initial strength here, and Klobuchar was stunning in elbowing Elizabeth Warren into fourth place and Joe Biden into fifth place in New Hampshire. Warren from Massachusetts and Boston's media gets into New Hampshire. She was expected to do much better. And I knew that Biden would stall. I actually thought it was going to come sooner than this. But here we are. Now to the debacle in Iowa. Tom Perez, the chair of the Democratic National Committee, who was handpicked by the Obama team, to keep Keith Ellison, a progressive, from running the party, is now under heat, especially from the Congressional Black Caucus. The top four members, including Barbara Lee and Karen Bass of California, Greg Meeks, and Benny Thompson, they wrote a lengthy letter and have demanded a meeting with Perez. And Perez has been totally lame. He has called for a partial recanvass of the count. But the benefit to either Sanders or Buttigieg of, being identified on caucus night as the person who won has evaporated. And the way Buttigieg very cleverly declared himself the winner when 0 votes had been revealed on caucus night in Iowa, that was pretty ballsy. I watched the other speakers, and they said, Klobuchar said we punched above our weight. Sanders said he thought they did very well based on their own counts of the caucus returns. But it was only Buttigieg who gave his victory speech. And the media played along with it and have positioned him or framed him, as a surging candidate. So Tom Perez responded to the Black Caucus. Let me reiterate, what happened in Iowa was completely unacceptable. While the Iowa Democratic Party runs the Iowa caucuses, we have shared responsibility, which we take seriously. But as we'll note in a moment, the app that we are told failed, and anybody who suggests nefarious activity, interference, or rigging has to sit down and shut up because the New York Times and other mainstream media outlets dismiss any concern about intentional rigging based on the use of this app, which came from a company tied to Clinton campaign people from 2016, including the director of the campaign, Robbie Mook. Funding came in part from the Buttigieg campaign. And yet we're told, nothing to see here, just a snafu. Troy Price, the party chair in Iowa, has resigned. His head has rolled in disgrace. And here from The Guardian today, an op-ed under the byline of a fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research and a professor of law and history at Yale. They lecture us. The boring incompetence that led to the Iowa primary fiasco generated Twitter fears and TV speculation that the Democratic National Committee, with a software company idiotically named Shadow, manned naturally by foreign agents, no, I haven't actually heard that, has hidden designs against Bernie Sanders. The most prominent theory of conspiracy isolates the illiberal fringe while casting the mainstream as rational. Well, this deployment of conspiracy theory is not the first. I saw it a lot from Warren backers on Facebook who claim that anybody who supports Sanders and challenged this mess was a conspiracy theorist and a Bernie bro and blah, blah, blah. And our friends over at the Gray Zone Project are hopping mad because the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which they accurately describe as an online censorship initiative of the Western government-funded German Marshall Project, falsely and hypocritically has characterized the Gray Zone and independent journalist Jordan Chariton as state-backed media, and implying that their factual reporting on the shadowy network behind the controversial app that undermined the integrity of the caucuses was somehow Russian-induced. This is payback because the Gray Zone has previously exposed the Alliance for Securing Democracy in a series of investigative reports as a neo-McCarthyite outfit prone to spreading disinformation, staffed by counter-terror cranks and national security hustlers. On February 10th, the ASD published a dubious analysis of a supposed Russian effort to spread conspiracies and disinformation around the Caucasus. It honed in on the Russian-funded Sputnik News and 3 shows broadcast by RT. And here's a quote. In addition, all the most popular tweets about Iowa retweeted in this time period by at least one monitored account pushed a narrative that the DNC seeks to undermine Sanders via nefarious means. Now, they are undermining him publicly, brazenly. The Hillary Clinton attacks, nobody likes Bernie. The Elizabeth Warren attacks, a woman can't win. And yet we're told to not even consider the possibility that behind the scenes they're doing the same shit. So, the Securing Democracy Twitter account said the Russian state-backed media ecosystem made a clear push to fuel conspiracy theories related to the Iowa caucus. And back to the Gray Zone. Their report says that the Gray Zone article that the ASD took issue with exposed the role of pro-Israel billionaire Seth Klarman, oh, that's the international conspiracy, I see, in pouring his money into the super PAC behind the faulty Iowa vote results app, while at the same time donating directly to candidate Pete Buttigieg. The Klarman Family Foundation also happens to be a major funder of the ASD. And one of the RT shows that they attack is Lee Camp, who is a very funny guy, a political humorist. And because his show is carried by RT, it's the easy connection just to declare that, Putin is right behind the screen there. And based on the way that corporate media, including MSNBC and the Democratic leadership, promoted the Russiagate narrative, that is alive and well in the vivid imaginations of so many Democratic voters. Then the Wall Street scream from Lloyd Blankfein, the former chief executive of Goldman Sachs, who is a big Hillary Clinton supporter. He said if the Dems go on to nominate Sanders, the Russians will have to reconsider who to work for to best screw up the U.S. Sanders is just as polarizing as Trump, and he'll ruin our economy and doesn't care about our military. If I'm Russian, I go with Sanders this time around. Now, this is a complete smear coming from a guy who's probably going to have higher taxes and more Wall Street regulation if Sanders prevails. My old buddy Faz Shakir, who is Sanders' campaign manager, said this is what panic from Wall Street looks like. Good line, Faz. Good line. So just a quick recap of the New Hampshire numbers. The electorate turnout was 57% female. The voter turnout exceeded 2008 and may have reached as high. I'm sorry, it exceeded 2016, may have reached the peak of 2008. Sanders carried 42% of the Latino vote and 33% of voters without college degrees. And I saw CNN last night on the plane coming back, where they were showing how Buttigieg and Klobuchar have picked up the higher income, better educated voters in New Hampshire, suggesting that these people are too rich and too smart to be duped by a commie socialist like Sanders. Now, in New Hampshire, Buttigieg performed strongly, less than 2 points in the popular vote behind Sanders, and Klobuchar came in third. And it was a strong showing for her. There is no doubt about it. But now we go to Nevada. And if you remember, this was the scene where Senator Barbara Boxer was presiding over a caucus in Nevada. Participants were very angry at the way it was manipulated to shift the vote to Hillary Clinton, and the false claim that one of the Sanders voters' supporters threw a chair, where the closest we could come is that somebody picked one up and put it down. No chairs were thrown. But the guy who was responsible for that report, John Ralston, who is kind of a big independent media guy in Las Vegas. He's got his own newspaper. He's got a TV show. And he's always fawned over when he appears on MSNBC. Well, he is promoting a rift between organized labor and Bernie Sanders. And it's because the Culinary Workers Union, which is very powerful in Nevada, is opposed to Medicare for All because they run their own health care plan. And they're promoting the Republican talking points that Sanders will deny choice to labor members, take away the union coverage that they bargained for, and leave them with some lousy government-run plan. And all Medicare for All does is replace the for-profit insurance companies and cut out up to 30% of the overhead in the delivery of health care in this country. And Kevin Gosztola at Shadowproof does a good job of airing out the story today, showing how this one union local, which was pretty closely aligned with Joe Biden, but may be shifting, I don't know that for sure, is basically using the same talking points that you heard from Michael Bennet, John Delaney, Amy Klobuchar, and Joe Biden when they were set up to attack Medicare for All during the debates up to this point. And that's not all. Over at the New York Times, the pundits are parading different ways of attacking Bernie Sanders. Nick Kristof opens his column by saying that, he didn't write about Mayor Bernie Sanders back in the 1980s, quote, underscoring that I have a record going back 4 decades of misjudging political talent. But that doesn't stop him from continuing that trend. He said he likes Sanders. He's poured his heart into ending American complicity in atrocities in Yemen. He's shown unusual political courage in criticizing Israel's land grabs in the West Bank. But his proposals have almost no chance of becoming law, particularly if the Senate stays in Republican hands. If there is to be some progress on health care, college affordability, or income inequality, or appointment of judges, it will come through the election of a new president with hefty coattails. Now, I argue that because Bernie Sanders will drive voter turnout to the highest level of any potential Democratic nominee, that his coattails will bring out progressive voters. The problem is they don't have many progressive candidates to choose from because the DNC, the DCCC, and the DSCC, respectively, continue to recruit wealthy, self-funding candidates, conservatives, including people who were Republicans, like Mike Bloomberg just a minute ago, and military veterans, like that fighter pilot who's taken on Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. These are not progressives. And so if Bernie lacks coattails, it's because the Democratic Party has moved to the right. And Nick Kristof has the faint hope that there is a Democratic nominee who can save Doug Jones, the senator in Alabama who's going to be facing the victor of a Roy Moore, Jeff Sessions primary. And that's a totally red state. Doug Jones is an accident of politics and Roy Moore. And I don't believe you should, turn the entire national ticket around trying to save Doug Jones, who I don't believe can be saved. And while he did hold his nose and vote for impeachment and stayed inside the party lines, and so did Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Doug Jones and Manchin, they vote with Trump whenever it is convenient for them. Then there is this disgusting column that was published yesterday under the byline of Thomas L. 6 More Months Friedman. The 6 more months refers to his repeated columns during the Bush administration, where he said that the Iraq occupation was going to turn around, just give it 6 more months, just surge in some troops, just 6 more months. So he turned me off initially by citing James Carville, who was working for Michael Bennet, who just withdrew from the race, the Colorado moderate milquetoast guy. And Friedman calls this a national emergency and that Democrats have to pick the guy who can win. Then he takes a detour to attack Bernie Sanders. He has the wrong solutions to the right problems. He's the wrong candidate to take down Trump, declares Tom Friedman, with absolutely no backup to his argument. Then he continues, please, Democrats, don't tell me you need Sanders' big, ill-thought-through, revolutionary grand schemes to get inspired and mobilized for this election. You want a revolution? I'll give you one. 4 more years of Trump. That'll be a revolution. And it'll do permanent damage to the institutions and norms that have sustained this country. So he's saying, don't think big. You have to think as some sort of a reptile. Put aside the issues, the fact that Mike Bloomberg is an authoritarian oligarch who thinks he can buy this election. And midway through the column, Friedman tips his hand that the only guy he believes can do this is Mike Bloomberg. And even if Bloomberg spends the entire billion that he's threatened to, I don't believe that TV ads attacking Donald Trump move any Donald Trump voters. It may cause some Democrats to say, okay, Bloomberg, I'll vote for you because I don't want more Trump. But we've seen Mike Bloomberg buy his way onto the debate stage. That'll be happening this coming month. We've seen him buy up support from Democratic mayors and others through long-term campaign contributions. And we've seen him, he dropped $300,000. That's not much, but the DNC then opened the door for him to come into the debates. So he can buy his way all the way up to the nomination, but he cannot buy the voter turnout that is necessary to beat Trump. And one of the things that most people who are now kind of drawn to Mike Bloomberg seem to ignore is that he is best known for promoting gun control laws. And I respect that, and I support most of his aspirations in that regard. But Trump is now sponsoring some sort of national order or law to allow open carry in all 50 states. And it was really weird in Florida to be in a restaurant and see people packing a gun on their belt, knowing the stand your ground law gives them the right to shoot and kill people under certain circumstances. And so Bloomberg's signature issue is gun control. That's going to galvanize the Trump voters and the gun nuts who he has been cultivating pretty successfully. Now, as if all of these tax attacks aren't enough, here come the Zionists. Yesterday on my Facebook feed, this post, and it's a quote from the Times of Israel, in a story headlined, The Jewish Nightmare of Bernie versus Trump. And a pull quote, More than any other leading politician, Sanders is responsible for mainstreaming the Corbynist wing of the Democratic Party. Now, God damn it, there isn't a Corbynist wing of the Democratic Party. This is pure concoction. But it feeds the fears of pro-Israel American Jewish voters. I'll quote again, the party's anti-Zionists like Linda Sarsour have gathered around Sanders. And Sanders himself supported Corbyn, ignoring the fears of British Jews who overwhelmingly saw Corbyn as an anti-Semite. So Bernie was supposed to support Boris Johnson? I mean, this is so unhinged. It is so irrational. So I wrote 2 words, cheap smear. And the poster responded, neither cheap nor smear. And I hit back, this is based on a tenuous guilt by association. Show evidence that Sanders is anti-Semitic, I've seen none, or withdraw the claim. Otherwise, it's a cheap smear. And this woman apparently had spent some time researching your humble host. Maybe spent time on my website with our superior search engine function? And she wrote back, sorry to burst your Bernie bro self-righteousness, but it appears a bit hypocritical to be indignant over what you refer to as Sanders' tenuous guilt by association when it's coming from someone, and here she's referring to me, who supports the 9/11 truth movement, parentheses, conspiracy theories, Lee Camp and Gareth Porter conspiracies, parentheses, Israel is behind the attack on Iran. Come on. Next, The Intercept. Apparently she is, and what you get here is she's smearing me in the same way, guilt by association. Now, I cover some of the stories published by The Intercept, but I am by no means a blind backer of everything that's published there. Anyway, she goes on, Counterpunch, Caitlin Johnstone, Shadowproof, Project Censored, RT, and one of my faves, The Gray Zone, founded by Max Blumenthal, who the Simon Wiesenthal Center named as one of the country's most prominent anti-Semites, and is devoted to pushing a pro-Assad line on Syria, a pro-regime line on Venezuela, and a pro-Hamas line on Israel. And here it's not clear whether she's referring to me or Max Blumenthal. Either you're working for the CIA or Mossad, or you're tied up with some terrorist group, or you've taken dirty money under the table. I don't know where any of that comes from. And she closes by saying Blumenthal has also denied that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, which I'm sure you agree with. And in fact, I do. Because I haven't seen any significant evidence. He apparently attended one dinner where some people who've been called anti-Semitic were in attendance. And that's all it takes. And I haven't composed my response to this stuff, but I will. And what really bothers me, and I've said this before, is that the weaponization of anti-Semitism to attack people who disagree with the policies of the right-wing government of the State of Israel is not only insulting, it is dangerous for those who are the real targets of real and virulent anti-Semitism. People who can fear for their lives, people who may fear that going to Jewish services could put them at risk for a gunman provoked by Trump. That's real anti-Semitism. Not these careless smears that because Sanders supported Jeremy Corbyn or because Linda Sarsour supports Bernie Sanders, that is solid proof of anti-Semitism. But we're going to see a whole lot more of this. That is for sure. One more item on Mike Bloomberg. Today, another video has surfaced from back in 2008 when he blamed redlining for the tanking of the Wall Street and also, it was caused by the housing crisis. It was really a lending crisis. But Mike Bloomberg sees the lenders as victims of federal laws that required them to write loans to black and brown and poor people. One of the things I want to add to my warnings of people who are willing to be seduced by Mike Bloomberg, consider now, post-impeachment, and we'll get to some of this in a minute, how Trump feels completely unconstrained. The Constitution, the Congress, the courts, nobody can touch him. Now, it's fair to say that we've been on an arc where George W. Bush, followed by Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump have expanded the notion of executive power at the expense of the other two branches. And if an authoritarian oligarch like Mike Bloomberg becomes president as a Democrat, do you think that he will say, oh, I'm not going to use the powers that Trump arrogated to himself? I'm going to go back to the good old days of working with Congress and accepting that if they don't approve my policies, we're not going to use my policies. And as further evidence of that, and the ego trip that he is on in trying to defeat Trump, Bloomberg spent millions of dollars to change the city charter of New York so that he could run for a third term. He considers himself so indispensable. That is a very dangerous indicator. So the Democratic primary race is now down to 8 candidates. I mentioned Michael Bennet dropped out. Deval Patrick, who never should have gotten in, the former governor of Massachusetts, he has bailed out. And the guy I'm really disappointed to say farewell to is Andrew Yang, because I think that he has been the freshest face, second to Tulsi Gabbard in some respects, where Yang was unabashed about his $1,000 guaranteed, $1,000 a month guaranteed individual income. He said, look, I'm the Asian guy who doesn't wear a tie. I'm a math nerd. That it wasn't Mexico or China who stole our jobs. It's automation and robots. He really changed the conversation in major ways. And as we say goodbye to him in the campaign, we expect him to be a part of a Democratic administration if there is one. And I am linking to my interview with Andrew Yang before anybody knew about him. I was one of the first to talk to him back in 2018. And if you're a Yang ganger, you might want to check that out. Every day when I remember, I pause to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like David Radcliffe, Elizabeth Vasquez, Doug Cooper, and Stuart Russell. They each chip in $5 or $10 a month. I think most of you could do that if you want to. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber, and when you hit the sign-up page, you can take it from there. So the other big news story that has broken over the last couple of days is Trump's efforts to interfere in the sentencing recommendations that the Justice Department will present for his old pal, dirty trickster, Roger Stone. And Trump says, you know, this is immoral, it's a disgrace, that Roger is just a victim. And he is. He's a victim of his own bullshit because he has been convicted by a jury of lying to the FBI because he couldn't keep his story straight. Very much like his mentor, Donald Trump. Maybe that's why Trump is going out of his way to interfere in an unprecedented way. And there's a good piece by Jimmy Risen over at The Intercept today, noting that Attorney General Barr is, in fact, the personal lawyer for the Trump family criminal organization. He's taken the place of Cohen, Michael Cohen, a two-bit crook now in prison, who never quite lived up to the standards of criminality and viciousness set by the infamous Roy Cohn. And if you want to read it, I'll link to it. Don't have time for further quotes. But this is a remarkable effort on Trump's part. And not only did Roger Stone lie to FBI agents, but he also threatened Randy Credico, another witness in the case, after Credico made it clear he wasn't going to play along with Roger Stone and hope to get a pardon. Trump has even tweeted criticism of the judge who is going to be sentencing Roger Stone, which is not a very bright thing to do. She is Amy Berman Jackson, and she sentenced Paul Manafort to prison, but not to solitary confinement, as Trump has falsely argued. And so the Democrats are reduced to pleading, begging the Chief Justice, John Roberts. Chuck Schumer, Senate leader of the Democrats, said Trump is once again attacking a federal judge. The nation now looks again to Chief Justice Roberts to make clear to Trump that these attacks are unacceptable. Well, Roberts is probably afraid, and Trump doesn't care. The other guy facing the heat of the tweet is former White House Chief of Staff and retired General John Kelly. In a speech Wednesday night, he defended Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who got frog-marched out of the White House last Friday in retaliation for his limited testimony in the impeachment investigation. But Trump is extracting his vengeance. And Kelly said that the lieutenant colonel was right to raise questions about the phone call that Trump made to Ukraine. Quote, he did exactly what we teach them to do from cradle to grave. He went and told his boss of what he just heard. We teach them don't follow an illegal order. And if you're ever given one, you'll raise it to whoever gives it to you that this is an illegal order, and then you'll tell your boss. So Trump responds by vilifying Kelly as, quote, way over his head as chief of staff, and that his public comments somehow violate a military and legal obligation to remain silent. No, those are mob rules, Don. Nothing in our military rules about that. Now, at first blush, this is pretty surprising. It's Attorney General Barr on ABC television this morning telling Trump that his attacks on the Justice Department have made it impossible for me to do my job. Quote, I'm not going to be bullied or influenced by anybody. Whether it's Congress, newspaper editorial board, or the president, I'm going to do what I think is right. I cannot do my job here at the department with a constant background commentary that undercuts me. Now, I believe that he is feigning outrage and independence here because he's already delivered what Trump wanted. Based on a tweet, he ordered his prosecutors to reduce the recommendation for a sentence for Roger Stone. And as you know, 4 of the prosecutors withdrew from the case. 1 resigned from the employment of the Justice Department. Then Trump congratulated Barr on Twitter for doing his bidding and turned around and said, well, I never told him to do that. So it is unusual for Barr to step out of his lane this way. But I think it's theater. Now, there are 2 moves on Capitol Hill in the last 24 hours that suggest that despite the way Trump controls the Republican Party, 8 Republican senators joined most Democrats in a 55-45 vote to require Trump to seek congressional authorization before taking any further military action against Iran. Now, it's mostly symbolic. It didn't reach the veto-proof 2/3 supermajority, and I don't believe it has passed the House so far. But it does show that some are willing to stand up to our dear tweeter. And several senators on the House Banking Committee have told reporters that they're not comfortable with Trump's nominee to serve as the number 2 on the Federal Reserve Board, Judy Shelton. She's a crackpot, and they worry that she would not be independent. But to see Richard Shelby of Alabama and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania defy the president's wishes and say, I don't think we can confirm this lady, it's noteworthy. It's not courage. It's not going to change things, but it's worth noting. And the House gave the Equal Rights Amendment, first proposed back in the 1970s, a new lease on life, by voting to remove a deadline for ratification that had been 1982. Now, this mostly became an abortion debate. And the Democrats, who I feel have gotten wimpy about abortion rights, were not wimpy on this. They showed that there are many other issues that Full equality for women would address, including pay inequity. And so we'll see if it's going to go to the Supreme Court ultimately, and we'll see how it plays out there. I'm disappointed to report that the McClatchy Company, the publisher of the Sacramento Bee, the Miami Herald, and 28 other newspapers across the country, has filed for bankruptcy and is going to be taken over by a New York hedge fund. This really sucks, because the McClatchy papers, Sacramento Bee, Modesto Bee, Fresno Bee, they're very important here in the state of California. And for a hedge fund to take them up is a real setback. And it's clear that the era of newspaper journalism is coming to an end in this country. Speaking of journalism, I'm glad to see that Consortium News, its board, has awarded its Gary Webb Freedom of the Press Award to Julian Assange this year. The final arguments are taking place in Harvey Weinstein's rape trial in New York. And I've not followed this, day by day. But his female lawyer, Donna Rotuno, may actually get a hung jury in this case, because she's been able to attack the victims. And their cases are a little bit uneven. Some of them said that even after he had forced them to have sex with him, that they continued to make contact with him and in some cases have sex with him as they tried to advance their careers. And that is an opening that the Weinstein legal team may be able to turn into a hung jury or even an acquittal. This is sketchy so far, but James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business, who I talked about and played some tunes from with Brad Schreiber in a recent in-depth interview podcast here at peterbcollins.com. Check it out if you haven't already. Well, a woman named Jackie Hollander has come forward contacting the district attorney in Atlanta, where James Brown died at the age of 73 on Christmas Day in 2006. We were told it was pneumonia. But without detail, Jackie Hollander is claiming that his death was caused by, quote, another person. Well, quickie report on my vacation to Florida. One of the highlights was visiting the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. If you've never been, it's fascinating. And the night before, we took a break from watching the Oscars to go outside and watch the launch of a fresh rocket from the Kennedy Center. Then the next day, we went for the tour, and it is just fascinating. I mean, you see a Saturn V rocket, you can almost walk into it. You see space shuttles that you can, really get a very close inspection of. There are a lot of great videos, history about the astronauts. And with that, I note that NASA is now reporting on data coming from the ultra-red peanut-shaped object that is the farthest object ever contacted by Earthlings. It's called Arrokoth, 1 billion miles beyond Pluto in the Kuiper Belt. And a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, Bill McKinnon, says that the findings are so significant that they've been left debating whether they would ultimately be viewed as more important than the satellite's first encounter with Pluto in 2015. It tells us some profound truths about our solar system. This is not just a space potato. It's a remarkable world that's told us a remarkable story. And as I wrap up the podcast today, just a few other details of Kathy and my trip to Florida. We had a good time with her sister Pat and husband Mike, and they showed us around. We had a lot of great fish. And we also took a 2-day side trip to the Gulf Coast of Florida, to Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Sarasota. And it's a beautiful side of Florida. We also met up with our expatriate friends, Jerry Fresia and his wife Chiki. We last saw them at Lake Como in Italy last summer, and Jerry hosts painting workshops for people who aspire to his level of skill and accomplishment in St. Petersburg every year, so we got together for brunch. But I do want to warn you, if you use Hotwire to line up a rental car, be sure to avoid one of their vendors called Easy Rent, spelled E-A-S-I-R-E-N-T. because I had the poor judgment to take a lowball offer from Easy Rent, and it was an awful experience that almost ended with Peter B. Collins being either cited or taken to jail by the local gendarmes. So it was 20 minutes to shuttle all the way out to this satellite location. I got there. There's a long line at the counter. After half an hour, I asked one of the people to speed it up, and he got a little hostile with me. Then it turned out he was the one who was going to handle my rental. When I got to the desk, he had a really nasty attitude, and he told me that my reservation had been canceled, and my $200 a week full-size car morphed into a minivan for $450 a week. And smelling bait and switch, I'm pretty slow to anger, but I got really pissed off, and I pushed over his computer screen in frustration. He came bounding out from behind the desk, pulled out his cell phone, and called the cops. He said he was going to press charges against me because he's had it with racist white people. Now, there was no racial undertone or overtone to this encounter. It was just the worst customer service I've ever experienced. 20 minutes later, 2 deputies from the Orange County Sheriff's Department showed up, and after talking to each of us, they declined to take any further action. And in fact, these cops were so considerate and nice that they voluntarily gave Kathy and me and our luggage a ride to a nearby McDonald's, the demilitarized zone where we waited for Pat and Mike to come and pick us up. So, my little issues notwithstanding, if you ever see Easy Rent, run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.